and welcome to another episode of the Policy Panchayat, where we speak to people who have and are still doing great work in the policy and development space and try to bring you insights from their careers and experiences on a variety of topics. My name is Swati, and I co-founded PPI, and now I'm working at Dalberg in an impact consulting role. Today, I'm speaking to Gopi, who's had a stellar career trajectory in the development and policy space. He's worked in a lot of different roles, interesting roles in the past. He's worked with Dr. Shashi Tharoor as a campaign coordinator. He had a stint at one of the UN agencies. He was a crucial part of the advocacy team at Center for Civil Society, where we crossed paths. And his experience in career development and his expertise in career development also draws a lot from his stint at the Indian School of Public Policy, where he was a senior manager looking after careers and placements. And now he is a senior officer of strategic communications at the Population Foundation of India. So like I said, he's been around, and I could think of no better person to have a chat on about careers in public policy, what the space looks like for maybe freshers, young professionals, and people from different walks of life. Over to you, Gopi. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you for that very grandiose introduction. Also, when you say I've been around, it makes me sound like 80, but so hopefully there is a lot more to go. And also, I think firstly, congratulations on your Dalberg, the start of a new journey. So that's great. It's also been great since I've seen you from CCS and your own growth.
I would really like to say that Gopi is the only reason why I'm in the policy sector. He literally gave me my first job in public policy.
It's a lot of flattery, but in any case, thank you for that. So I think that's also a great kind of growth trajectory in the policy space if you see you yourself are right? So maybe one thing I thought I could talk about, which would I was thinking of what would be a value addition for those who are seeing this, and I thought we had this framework while I was at the Indian School of Public Policy, and the thing is that when we started the Indian School of Public Policy, there was very little other competition we could learn from in terms of placements, because there was very few placement cells that really focused only on policy jobs. Right? So we had to kind of come up with our own framework, come up with our own kind of mechanisms. And many jobs in the policy space when we started were called other names. So we had a lot of corporate affairs, which was government relations in many sense. And many jobs we just didn't mention the word policy, because it was pretty much in the same space. Right? And I think one thing which I personally see in my 2+ years while I was at the Indian School of Public Policy is the increased acceptance of policy jobs, right? So it was always a great thing when we saw the first year when we were not called a firm, when we saw the JD, they asked for a master's or a degree in social development or international relations, public administration. They never mentioned public policy. But by the second year, after they came for placements at with us, and they started adding masters in public policy also as a degree requirement. Let's say one of the degrees they're looking at. So I think that is something I've seen across the board. So the space is very much expanding, and like pretty much most things, there's no right way to define the kind of jobs or job functions in the space. So this has been, in some sense, my own way of trying to make sense of it. So I make no claims to saying that this is the way, but this could be. But I would say that this would be one way to look at it to make a little more sense, especially if you're somebody who's new to the field, especially if you're somebody who's at the periphery of getting into the policy space, and if you want to know where you want to grow your trajectory to. So I thought this might be something of use. So that's it about the intro. So I think and again, Swati, do interrupt if my monologue gets too long. So please free to ask questions. So generally we look at, when we say about jobs in the space, job functions, right? We look at 8 different types of job functions in the policy space. And again, there are some organizations which just focus on one of these functions. Most organizations are looking at different elements of it. There are many firms where this is just one part of many other even non-policy work that they do. Right? So this is a very broad definition of the job function, I would say. Right? So that's the way I would like to define this. So so that's it. So moving on to the types, I think the first one we can kick off with is research and development. So policy research, very common. Now, when I say why I call it a little more in terms of research and development is that a lot of research jobs are looking into policies that are upcoming, right? Or let's say it's about the development of policies. And think of it, let's say AI, right? Think of all the regulations around cryptocurrencies. I think even Swati, we both at CCS worked, we had looked at the whole direct cash to, like direct benefit transfers or some of the ideas that we had worked on, school choice. These are not ideas which are there or policies which are currently there in the public domain. So how do you, but how do you kind of make that something that is legitimate? So there are organizations, research organizations, think tanks, some academia, right, which works on different policy pilots. They think of a policy, let's say the direct benefit transfer, cash transfers directly to people instead of giving them subsidies or, let's say, LPG cylinders, etc. You kind of pilot it in a small pace. You learn from what are the pros and cons of it. Obviously, there'll be many issues. Then you retry the policy and you try implementing it again with do multiple pilots, iterate till you find a good enough model, and then you kind of present it to the government. Uh, and then they, if all goes well, and if you are the buy-in, they push the big red button and it gets implemented on a large scale. But there are many organizations which are working on many policies which are in the cutting edge or which are a new way to look at even current issues. So that's one element of it, which is the policy research. And again, most of our think tanks, research and academia, I would say, the major organizations in this space. So second one is implementation. Right? Now, even though, and you will see this, it's happening a lot more these days that kind of public welfare is kind of disseminated through private means in many cases. So if you look at, let's say, Digital India, if you look at Swachh Bharat, if you look at skilling initiatives by different governments, many of these are carried out by different other firms. For example, Swachh Bharat, so I know Tata Trust does a big role in actually kind of working out that out. I know that KPMG is heavily involved in the Ministry of Health. We had few scholars placed there who was in the Ministry of Health, right, working as KPMG people. Uh, and then we had, like, there is let's say I know that PwC is involved in skilling. So there are many of these big firms which are very much involved in implementing different government policies. At times, if you're looking at the consulting firms, they at times act as the in betweens. Perhaps they also have, kind of delegate a lot of this work to other grassroots organizations. At times, and they involved in the direct implementation to various levels. But essentially, the thought is that there is a lot of implementation, obviously, across the country when you look at any policy. And there are many other organizations that work in implementing these policies. You could be part of those organizations. You could be helping in implementing these policies. Right? Another very, let's say, very popular way of this model of this right now is all these fellowships. So even at the fellowships, essentially you're kind of working in the policy implementation space. And it's also a great way to kind of get into the space. But one thing I would add is that but beyond that, in many cases, you would need experience to kind of grow on this stream. So that's just there. But yeah, so that's just the policy implementation side of things. Moving on from implementation, the next one is monitoring and evaluation. And I mean, this I think back in, I think last year, it was huge. I mean, there was a sudden boom in M&D job roles, especially in the space. I mean, I don't know why. Maybe it was they were trying to make sense of all their COVID programs that there are, which they put out. I don't know the reason why, but M&D is a very, it's a very hot job even now. I feel you need specific data skills to kind of crack into that job function, but it's a very essential function. And maybe a way to think about what it is that if you look at, let's say, Manrega, right? It's a government program for providing jobs and employment. There's a certain way it's being rolled out right now, but that's not perhaps the best way it could be. Right? You need people to kind of evaluate its impact, right? And then perhaps then suggest what are the ways in which you need to better it. And most policy programs, most such programs do require constant monitoring and evaluation to make it incrementally better. Right? And now, in most cases, these guys are contracted with government agencies. Some of them are working independently, but this is a huge job function in the market. Right? And some of them are actually being contracted by, let's say, big international development organizations to assess the efficacy of different programs which are running. But that's one major chunk of jobs. After that is analysis. I would personally, and it's not really a definition, but I personally put this uh, caveat in differentiating. So I put this difference between research and analysis because the way I kind of look at this is that um, when you look at monitoring and evaluation, it's about being part of the system and try to improve it, understand it, right? But at times, certain policies are so wrong, or else at times the things are so, let's say, there are basic issues, or maybe for many different reasons, you need to be really outside of the system to take it to analyze it. And that's where a lot of this policy analysis comes into play. Again, think tanks, academia, and I mean, what ideally should be the primary, like avant-garde of policy analysis should have been media, which is the fourth pillar of democracy. But that's, in these days, a little bit more of a weak pillar as things are.
Yeah.
But every single media organization has a policy.
Right.
They have a department which kind of works in analyzing policies, what are the pros, what are the cons. There are think tanks which look at the efficiency of different programs. There are obviously many academics which do a lot of research on how different programs are panned out. But this analysis is a big component of different policy you know, functions. There are many organizations in the space, but again, I think quantitative way there is a lot of competition. Sorry, in the qualitative way there's a lot more competition. So just maybe that's something to keep in mind, especially for freshers. Right? Um, and the next one after analysis, I would say, is advocacy. It's where it's kind of my also home ground, which I'm really keen about. Um, so I see, in some sense, advocacy and lobbying are two sides of the same coin. So if you're kind of pushing for the street vendor, you're doing advocacy. If you're pushing for the big oil manufacturer, it's lobbying. But essentially, what this means is that you are ensuring that they have a seat at the table, both when policies are being designed as well as they're being implemented. Right? And I'll tell you just one example to kind of put this through. Back while I was doing my work with the MP of Trivandrum. So while I was in Trivandrum, we had this thing about there was this huge issue of how Trivandrum didn't have an escalator, railway station didn't have an escalator or a lift. And I remember this picture of there was a lot of criticism of the government of not making this happen. There are a lot of old people also in Kerala, so for them also it was really difficult. So I think so we while at the MPF we also thought this was something which we were very passionate about. We also lobbied with the ministry. We used MP lads, and we helped build a escalator. And then inauguration and all was over. And I think after 3 months or something, we went for an inspection. And this is where I was. This was the time I was. We went there and it should be great, right? You're walking in, everyone's happy. You really played a huge part in it. So great votes, everything, So it's a win-win for everybody. Also, we thought. But we walked in and we got surrounded by porters because they used to get about, let's say, 400 some rupees a month, a day. But now it's really gone down because only the people who have very heavy luggage are hiring them because now there are escalators and lifts. You don't need to carry. And there were major loss of income. Many of them took loans from illegal vendors to lenders to kind of get these licenses in the black market. Many of them are old, and they had a system where they give smaller luggage to these people who are older, in an informal system. And so now they were there saying that my wife is in the hospital, I'm old, I don't even have anything I can carry with me. The others were saying that I don't have the money now, I'm not making enough to repay my lender. And it was genuinely sad. And it's not like they were purposefully excluded while this, let's say, this development scheme was being done. But the fact is that nobody really thought of it. Let's say if they were there at the table while these decisions were being made or being planned, we could have made some avenue for that. Right? Maybe a reskilling, whatever it may be, but at least that would have been thought. So that's why you need somebody to be, it's necessary to have a voice while you're planning different development schemes. On the other hand, let's say if you think of your favorite chai wala, right? The reason why, it's very necessary for that person to be at that spot wherever he is for him to make the money that he's making, right? Now, when you have under the smart cities program and all, well, let's say street vendors do have allotted zones, but they're very indiscriminately put when it comes to the implementation. So they've been taken from this place and dropped on a random road here with 10 other chaiwalas, and their income really drops. So they also need somebody to kind of voice their concerns. Right? So both in terms of implementation and when you're deciding, it's necessary for different stakeholders or people who are part of it or people who are affected by this to have a voice and have a seat at the table, or at least have a voice. Their voice is kind of being heard. So that's why advocacy and that's why lobbying. On the other hand, let's see if you think of the solar manufacturers. Right? The GST of I think solar cells went up from 8 to around 12% last year. I think 21. So they were already struggling to compete with China and other international people. Right? And so for them also it's a big issue, right? So how what do? They come together. They had a major some association. They tried talking to the government. I don't think it succeeded, but that's what you do, right? Because it's a genuine concern. So that is why advocacy and that is why lobbying pretty much comes under the same bracket. But if you're part of the FCRA, which is most non-profits, I think they end up calling it strategic communications or strategic engagement these days. But this is what it is. Moving on from that, the next one, and this is a slightly deviant one, it's grant making. Right? Why I think this is a job which policy people should look into is because at the end of the day, philanthropy, sorry, I wouldn't call it grant making, I would say philanthropy. Right? Because philanthropy has huge development implications. Right? We kind of moved on from the whole development age of the 60s and the 70s, where IMF and big players dropping in aid, right? So we moved on from that to now it's era of philanthropy, and you have huge players spending so many dollars, more than the budgets of different countries, right, in terms of development and improving people, and huge implications across. So when you're working in these firms, it's also necessary to know who you're funding and what is the policy implications of it. Right? And just a classic example is to think of as tribals versus the environment. Right? There are, I mean, on one hand, tribals are some of the most, like they're really unfortunate, let's say, disadvantage in let's say, in financial terms, mostly because they're living in an area with so much natural resources, but they can't even sell it. Right? And it's really unfair because the government can come and sell their land to somebody, but they don't have the right to sell it. And the government will earn crores, but these people will be paid pittance. And but on the so it's a really sad situation that they've been forced into, and it obviously makes a lot of sense to help them fight for their rights, help them get more prosperous. That's one school of thought. The other thought is also that you see the climate change is not a hoax. We need to save the forests as much as we can. Man's greed knows no bounds, or so if you let people loose, if you again allow people to sell wherever they are, then we won't have any forests left in the state. Again, but it's a genuine, at the end of the day, genuine environment concern too. Now, you are a philanthropic body. Who are you funding? There are NGOs working on both sides of the street. There are many development organizations, but you need to understand the consequences of these actions too, right? Both the seen and the unseen. So in some sense, I think it's also necessary why it's encouraging for, I would say, policy people to work in these firms, work in philanthropy, because that has huge development implications. Right? Moving on from that, I would say the next one for me would be policy communications. And this, again, a field that I think both Swati and I have worked in. So let's think of Swachh Bharat. Right? Think of Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. Hindi is not great, but I think you got what I was trying to say. Both Swachh Bharat and both of these are very, at the end of the day, behavioral change campaigns. Right? It requires behavior change from people. And now imagine a country like India, where you have so many people speaking so many different languages, and many of them who can't even read and write. Right? How do you convince and persuade people with, for so different and so diverse, for a cause that you believe, which might mean nothing to them? So in that sense, it's very necessary for every policy to be communicated efficiently, right? Because any policy that is people don't know is just an old rule on some book which nobody has ever read. So it's necessary. So communication is a very integral and necessary component of any policy, right? Because awareness has to be there of what they they have the right. So that's why policy communications. A lot of firms work in it. I think MSL was working on Jal Shakti for many other organizations, PR agencies. There are governments. Given the government has small cut roles which kind of come in communications, IEC materials. So it's a very strong component, the place you could work in. And as much as, let's say, the policy needs communications and marketing, so does the politician. So the other side of, I would say, this is also political marketing, which is again huge. I think the whole Prashant Kishore and IPAC had really taken that, uh, blown that up. But I think there are many firms which kind of deal with it nowadays. So there are many different organizations which look at political marketing. It's a very exciting space. Elections are really fun to work with. So, but yeah, it's a very high stress job. But again, but it's, I think in some sense also what the validation is good. So that's also something we could look at. And moving on from there, and obviously, if you study public policy, you understand administration. If you understand the consequences of different actions, and I think it's also, I think the eighth and the perhaps the most important job you could try for is politics itself. Right? You could, of course, be at the front end and the back end of it. You could stand up for elections, but you could also work with the political parties on the back end. Most of the major parties have actual, like salaried jobs that they offer. You might, it's many of these are not really visible out there. It might not be there on LinkedIn or uh, let's say on Naukri.com, but actually more on LinkedIn, because if you know the right people, you need to kind of slightly network to find these jobs. But there are many jobs with most of these parties are hiring. They always need some people to help both in analytics, in marketing, in social media management, so on and so forth. But yeah, that's also space you could work in. Many MLAs and MPs are now taking people, and LAMP really pushed this with about having all of them having policy research people inside their offices. So that's also something to do. But essentially working within the political space. So that's, I mean, it's not just one job. You work in that, you have to do multiple things always, right? From speech writing all the way to creating, like, things that you want to put parliament. But anyway, so that's kind of the job. But yeah, so if I had to put it in some sense, these are kind of the different 8 types of job functions. Just to recap, you have like research and development, you have implementation, you have monitoring and evaluation, you have analysis, you have advocacy, you have philanthropy, you have policy communications and politics. So that's kind of, at least in my very narrow perspective of things, is what I would say are the different types of jobs.
Thank you, Gopi. I think that's a beautiful framework. I'm sure that one question that most people have is, that what kind of jobs even are there in the policy space, in the development space. So you've laid it out very beautifully. I was taking notes throughout, and like just jotting down some pointers. But just drawing from what you spoke about, of course, there are these 8, 9 areas where people can sort of work. But if I'm to look at it from, say, a fresher's perspective, right? Say I am right out of college, I've studied, say, I don't know, history, for example. What sort of places would be looking for a person who has no experience or maybe no formal education in policy as well? Where in this framework, in what all areas could I fit in?
So I think, see, I'll say one part of it is just that the field is getting a little competitive, right? So it's a little more than perhaps a little when it was before, right? So even getting perhaps like a more, even like a certificate course or something of that sort, and there's so many these days, right? In public policy, it does help, in some sense, at least on your CV. But essentially, I would perhaps, it also depends on what is the skill set that you have. It's, it boils down to that, right? if if you are somebody who is good with data, if you have if you know your Excel really well, if you know R, or if you're good with Python, research is a very strong field which always has a lot of demand. And both M and monitoring and analysis and research. So, and let's say All these roles have junior spots, but if you have these quantitative skills, you always have a leg up when it comes to research. Right? Even if the job requires both qualitative and quantitative, or even if it's like 60-70% qualitative, somebody who has a quantitative always has an edge. That's what, at least from my experience, we found. So that's one part of it. If you are good with comms, again, huge potential, right? But you should know your, at least your Canva. Right? You should know your, some decent amount of design. You should be able to have decent amount of creativity. Um, and then again, you could apply for any of these. I mean, in terms of the comms perspective of it. The other part of it, I mean, so if, let's say, if somewhere in the middle, I would say it's great to start with, let's say, fellowships or jobs which are the program officer roles. Right? So if I have to put for freshers, these are three major categories which you can get. It's horribly difficult to get into philanthropy and all at the beginning. Right? So they usually take people with experience in the development space. Uh, it's hard to get into a, so but the basic three skills of, let's say, comms, research, and program management are kind of like the starter element of it. In comms, you can go into any comms role in any of these organizations. Uh, think tanks may be a great way to start, honestly. The pay is not extremely great, but you will have great exposure to policy, right? And everything in the space. If you're, again, for research also, I would say, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm a little, let's say, biased towards that, but yeah, I think also even research, you could either join a research organization or you could work in think tanks or spaces related to that. Um, in program side, no, that's a slightly different track where I would say you could try for fellowships, the CMGGA there. I mean, there are now tons of it. CMGGA was kind of like the starting, which really brought this up. But there are tons of these fellowships. Please really go for them. It's a great start to your career. So fellowships, I would say, are like a wonderful Kickstarter in many ways because you get to do so much in within that 1 year. So I'm personally, I'm very much for it, especially in that first half. And LAMP, all that, right? It really requires an multitude of skills. It's not like something which is usually for one thing. You really need to be slightly well-rounded to get in, and to kind of perform. And also you come out even better. So that's something I would recommend. Otherwise, what I would say is that many of these development firms do have like program officer roles, right? That might be somewhere you can get into. Since once you understand the development space, you kind of upgrade to the policy space in some sense, right? If you're not directly, if you don't have an economics degree or if you don't have a policy degree in the background. But if you're going on the program track, it's you usually start with something which is more on the implementation side, right? And then you kind of, once you have built the perspective, you kind of upgrade to it. But one thing I would also say in this is that public policy is also a career track, like genuinely. It's not like you, so never look at it like your job and be sad that, oh, I'm not getting everything I wanted. It's because you will not, right? It is kind of like a long-term track which kind of goes a long way. And if you look at Facebook and even the big players in the space, they hire people who have 5 to 6 years of public policy experience. Right? So you don't even crack into that till you have that solid experience in the space. So I think in many cases public policy is very kind of focused on the experience part of it. So do focus on gaining it because it is a kind. Uh, Other element, I'm just also thinking out loud what are the spaces would be to start with. I think, I mean, frankly, from what I've kind of seen is that there are a lot of these smaller organizations, which actually work in the policy space now. Join them. I mean, you get really good exposure. Practically everything. Right? But it doesn't have to be like a long-term commitment because it won't be a long-term commitment. No, but none of you are going to stay more than 2 or 3 years. Like it's a rare if that ever happens. But at least I mean, maybe that's the lament of a placements person that people tend to jump jobs. But seriously, but it's mostly that's the case. So think what you want to learn in those next 2 years. Which is a place I can learn the most in those first 2 years when you're starting the career. Join that space. And usually smaller firms, I would say, are better. to kind of give you that experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Gopi, you spoke about how now people, I mean, today there are job descriptions which require a master's in public policy, even though this degree didn't exist a few years ago, right? So the landscape of jobs in policy is changing completely. And it's just a comment adding to what you just said that um, today more jobs are available to people who are not coming from a policy background. Like when I joined Center for Civil Society, I had a degree in media and communication. I had no idea what politics and policy look like. However, it's all about finding that right fit for you, for your skill set, that you can use to eventually get to where you want to be. Yesterday somebody was asking me, where can I work in policy that will give me a very good idea of what public policy is like? I'm like, there's no organization like that. Every place will give you a very different sort of experience, and you have to use that to sort of figure out where your interests are and what's happening in the space. So great insights, Gopi, on that. And I think one more question that I have, and I think a lot of people ask us at PPI as well, is about how economically feasible is it to work in the development sector. I think for the first 2 years of my time here, my mom didn't think I was earning anything because I was working at a think tank, which is traditionally like an NGO. And even today, a lot of people think that people are reluctant to come to this space because they don't think that they can earn well here, that there isn't a very good growth trajectory. However, the framework that you just laid out for us also talks about very big organizations rich in funding who are looking for people who can come and utilize their resources in the right places. So what would you say to people like that, people who are not sure about what I mean, can this really be a life plan for somebody to work in the policy and development space?
So yeah, so I think I'll just go back to what which I said was that this is a career, right? So it is something that does move forward. So I mean, in some sense, is it a is it a job or a career where you have to be you feel that you'll be economically handicapped? Absolutely not. There are so many organizations that pay truckloads of money. But again, it depends on where you are. So but that's the same regardless whether you have an MBA or whether you have finance degree or whether you have an engineering degree. You could be working as an engineer for 8,000 rupees. You could be working as an engineer for a couple of lakhs, right? So that kind of depends on where you are, and a lot also depend on how you grow yourself. Right? What is the experience and the qualities that you kind of build on the way. Right? So I mean, I really say that I don't think people should be bogged down where they start off with, because it's really a path, right? And I think, but one thing I would also say to anybody who's in the policy space, it's also a job with a lot of validation, genuinely, because there is a constant intellectual stimulation wherever you work, and that's something that you don't get with the boring. Like, I mean, it's not at all monotonous. You're not really just sitting there and working brainlessly. Every moment really draws a lot out. And I think that is something very special and very wonderful about working in the policy space. And with every skill that you add, you're also building your capacity, your capability, your knowledge, your domain. And with that, your money that you can make will also increase exponentially. Right? So I don't think, and I mean, and I'll give a good, I mean, I don't even take my word for it. I think a great way to explain this is that if you look at the organizations which are starting courses on public policy, right, you have all the IITs, IAMs, right? IMA, IMD, or NLSU already had a public policy degree. All the IMs are also getting into the thing. Do you think, these organizations would get into it if there were not also pay packs which are matching their stature? No, there are. So there are jobs across the space. There are major consulting firms in the space. Uh, and even more than that, let's say even, I mean, an interesting space which I've also seen now is many of the industries are starting their own policy wings. They used to have policy shops which are small, but most of them are growing like rapidly these days. And if you look at startups, they're already hiring. Even small startups are hiring a policy officer. So I think, the space is really expanding. So it's not a it's expanding as much as any booming area right now. And I think I don't see I don't I mean I'd be surprised with the fact that if you say that there's a money constraint, because there genuinely is. And I think and maybe to even add one more lane is that even as placements, that while I was doing there, get fairly good packages. If you compare to the non-profit space, we're actually really a country. So So I don't see that as a problem. I think
Yeah.
yeah.
I think that's a big myth buster for sure, because a lot of people face this problem. I mean, even when I entered, I didn't know where it could go. But again, I think it's all about having the right kind of conversations with people, who can give you the right kind of insight. I think we can wrap it up with maybe one final thought from you. You mentioned a lot about what kind of skills you would need to enter into which part of the framework that you talked about. If you were to summarize it for me and maybe say three or four, maybe a combination of hard and soft skills that people should have or should build on while they're looking to make a good career in policy and development, what would that look like?
Okay, so I think in terms of soft skills, I think soft skills are non-negotiable, right? Regardless of whether you're working with bureaucrats or if you're working with the people, you need soft skills, right? Working with communities is very difficult, and you're talking to people who have lived experiences which is very different from your own. So having the empathy and having the ability to communicate with them, to be able to also engage with them, is very necessary. On the other hand, if you're dealing with bureaucrats, which you often will have to, again, a whole different ball game. You need to kind of really learn. I mean, unlearn a lot of the progressive thoughts that you have, and but also kind of there's a lot of there's a different way of engaging, right? And there's a lot of it's a hierarchy which is built a lot on respect in a certain terms and notions. So you have to understand that, and to understand that, you need to have the ability to kind of engage with them in that certain manner. So soft skills are really non-negotiable. Where except for the one concept, well, the one notion that if you want to be just a purely a policy researcher, if you really are excellent at economics, if you really are excellent at all those things, and if you want, what you're great at it, if you're great at is kind of shutting yourself in a room, working throughout and producing like excellent reports, you'll get through. So it's subjective to that degree in terms of what like in that sense. But otherwise, mostly if you're on anything on the front end, you need communication skills, you need good soft skills. Uh, More than that, I think the three major skill sets I've said, and I think I said one before was also, uh, if I had to put it, one is that if you have good communication skills, design skills, all that, great. You can work anywhere in a lot of different elements of the policy space. Right? The second element is the research skills that you need. Right? If you have, if you know your Stata, if you know your Python, if you know qualitative methods, if you know how to design surveys, if you know how to do focus group discussions, all that stuff, uh, that's a very good skill that you should have. And it's good to have in this space. Uh, on the third one is more in terms of management, right? It's not I don't know how you can learn it from a course, because in many cases that program officer role, and programs is a huge space, but that's also somewhere in some sense you need to work and learn on it. But basically what you need an aptitude for that is again a lot of ability to engage, right? Make your work on your PowerPoint presentations, work on your Excels. And that is not just for public policy, anywhere in life you go. Uh, that really helps. And maybe I'm just trying to pull it together. One thing I would say is that when we were doing placements there at ISBP, we kind of analyzed the interview formats of all the different firms, right? And we kind of are trying to figure out, kind of re-engineer it, and kind of figure out backwards on what are the things that our scholars need to learn to be able to crack this interviews. And maybe in those terms, I would add that many of these uh, firms at their entry level, I mean, at least at their filtration level, had these kind of questions. One is a technical round, and technical round generally what they will ask is that they'll give you 2 hours and they'll say, write about the impact of COVID on agricultural policies, or how does that impact this, right? And you might be great at giving a report, or might be great at writing an assignment, a thesis, a dissertation. But to do that in 3 hours, it's a really different ballgame, right? And you also need to do make your footnotes. You need to do the proper work. So being able to do that at a fast pace, very important skill set. Secondly, most of them had some level of Excel questions, right? So at least to know your VLOOKUP, how to do your pivot tables, to sort, basic Excel skills. always a good bet when you're looking to kind of crack into these interviews. The third one is all of them almost have situational or behavioral questions, which is in the sense that tell me about a time when you had to have face a conflict in your team. How did you solve it? And you can find these questions online, but it's very important that you answer these questions in a certain manner. I mean, not that it has a single right answer, but you need to answer in a certain direction, right? So to kind of look up all these questions, that is one other element that key. Then you have the guesstimates and the case questions. These are mostly for the consulting firms, but now it's kind of seeping through the system. Right? So you will face case questions and guesstimates in different places. So if not, maybe just in terms of the skill sets you need to thrive at these firms, these might be the certain skill sets that you need to kind of get into them, right? So maybe that's one way to think about it. To thrive at it again, it's very subjective to the space because again, the policy space is so very diverse. But at the end of the day, I think, but at the end of the day, as long as you find your validation in the work, that's that's a space.
I would just like to thank you, Gopi, for taking out the time. I think this was an excellent conversation. We're going to put a lot of the information in the show notes as well so that people can sort of sift through it. And we'll also put a link to Gopi's profile in the bio so you can reach out to him, look at the work that he's doing. And yeah, thank you, Gopi.
Thank you, Swati. Thank you, Swati, for inviting me to this. And honestly, I've seen, I think, public policy India grow, and it's really fantastic. And I think you guys keep growing and you keep developing it really to the next level. So, congratulations.
Thank you so much,
All the
Gopi.
best.
You've been a very strong supporter since the beginning. So very happy to host you.
And happy to support and push you guys as well, however way I can. So,
Thank
thank you.
you.